Hey BookTube, it's Angie. Finally getting around to filming some of these autism videos. I'm filming in my kitchen because I kept trying to set this up in my library and I always wait too late to start filming these, just with other things I have to do with the day. Sometimes the lighting in my library when it goes towards the evening gets really harsh and I kept trying to set this up and it seemed like every angle I shot from it was looking like I was this really haggard woman with no eyebrows, which is not the look I want to project on here. I don't have any of the umbrella lights yet around here. I just recently got a decent tripod, so one upgrade at a time. But I came in the kitchen because a lot of times, for whatever reason, the kitchen lighting is a little bit softer. It's not perfect in here, but it is better than what it looked like in there. So I figured we'd shoot from here tonight. And I guess if I have future videos that are later in the evening, you may see a few other BookTube videos shot from here just because it's a little less harsh. So yeah, that's why some of these videos may be in my kitchen, just because it's a little bit more aesthetically pleasing. So today I'm going to talk about this monster book I mentioned in my shelf picking video that I was sent for review because I've been doing all this autism reading for Autism Awareness Month this month. Worked my way through this one. This just came out recently, just in the last few months I think, and this is called In a Different Key: The Story of Autism by Donvan Caren Zucker. And it's basically, I guess the best way I can describe it is it's basically pretty much a history of autism from the early cases when it wasn't even given a name yet, up through when the traits were officially deemed as autism and later Asperger's. It talks about the first cases of the people that were the very first cases of people that were officially deemed autistic. And they also talk about some historic cases going back into like the 16th, 17th century of famous, or not, I don't know famous, but like documented cases of people that were deemed like the village idiots or just insane or something like that. These two doctors go back and they look at these cases and say more than likely those people were probably autistic, we just didn't have the name for it back then. I'm just going to talk about this one book in this video because this thing is about 700 pages long. Now that's not all 100% text. There is a good portion of it that's just like footnotes and bibliography. I will also say this book is printed in rather large print given the size, so that also may attribute to how big it is. But I'll show you. Page 552 is where the epilogue ends, and then all the rest of this book is just footnotes, index, bibliography, timelines, that kind of thing. Appendices, you might say. So, where to start with this book? This covers so much, so I wanted to do a video about this, but I was a little bit overwhelmed as to what all to cover because given the size of it, obviously I don't want to cover every single thing because we'd be here for hours. Also, you may hear or see my cat pop up here because he's usually, if I'm sitting at the table, he likes to hang out here too, and so if you see a flicker of a tail, or oh, there he is right there. This is Max. Hey Max, you're on video. You don't care. Okay. So Max may be making a guest appearance every so often, but he'll probably just lay down here in a second. So the book starts with the story of Donald. Donald was the very first person who was officially given the term autism for the traits he had. Prior to that, there were people that had his similar traits, but they didn't have the autism name for it. A lot of times it was most often found in children and they were often institutionalized. These kids were sent to institutions, usually by the doctor's recommendation. The parents, they didn't know what to do. Doctors back in the day, they would just write it off as you know, it's probably best just to put them in a home and let professionals take care of them. These people that were institutionalized, they were often given the most random and wide scope of diagnoses. They were said to have glandular disorders, they were said to have schizophrenia, they had like blood disorders, or you know, they were just mentally incompetent or insane. It's just nobody knew. Everybody was guessing. They just knew that these people had certain traits, and that once you saw these traits, then you pretty much just wrote off that person. And that's the way it was for the longest time. And Donald's story starts in the 1930s, I want to say it was. Might have been a little bit later, but I want to say it was around the 1930s that he first comes on the scene as a small child. The thing they noticed with Donald found a lot of comfort in patterns, amazing sense of recall for information, but they also found that he was one of the first cases they saw where the love of patterns was so strong that if you took those patterns away, then it often led to Donald going into a sort of tantrum or a fit. So initially his parents, under a doctor's recommendation, did institutionalize him for a short period. Most children that were institutionalized, it was not for, at least for these kind of traits, it was not for a lifetime. Usually what they did was they would have the kids in there for short bursts. It would be 3 to 6 months, sometimes 9 months. It usually didn't go beyond 9 months. And then they were sent back home and saw how they did. And then if it was still an issue, then they were sometimes re-institutionalized. And it just went like that until the parents or doctors or both decided that, you know, this particular child might need to be permanently put in a home. And in Donald's case, he was one of the first ones to do an extended stay kind of in one of these temporary situations. When the norm was about 9 months, Donald's stay lasted, I think they said over a year, maybe a year and a half. At the time, the way the homes worked, I'm not saying that all of them were bad, but there was a pretty bad reputation for a lot of these institutions that were going on at the time. A lot of the people that were sent in, both children and adults in different places, but a lot of times with the children, they were sent into these places, and you can imagine being separated from their parents, being separated from any sort of comfort or familiarity that they had previous to that. They would go into these homes and they would have all their personal possessions taken away. They were given communal toys to play with. Everybody had to play with the toys in the same room. They had their clothes taken away, and they were given these sort of uniform, I guess you might call it. It was basically like a tank top and shorts, white tank top and shorts, and everybody was put in that same type of outfit. And that was on the mild side. The more extreme cases of places that were later deemed snake pit institutions, those were the places that would have more extreme situations of kids not even having clothes. They would just be left by themselves usually, or with maybe 1 or 2 other adults, and they were just left naked to sit in their own excrement. They would just be expected to writhe on the ground. If the children displayed really strong behavioral issues, if they spoke up at the wrong time or anything, like if they did anything that the doctors or nursing staff saw as problematic or threatening, there were more extreme cases of these institutions chaining patients to the bed, using electroshock therapy. There were some documented cases of patients being injected with drugs that would make them cramp or vomit so that they would be too distracted to speak or cry out. Some patients even had LSD treatments tried on them to see if that would be a better way to control them. These really horrible conditions for these patients. And like I said, this wasn't across the board every institution. There were just certain ones that had these reputations that were slowly leaking out. And it was just a scary time to have your child institutionalized, because you can imagine it's hard to know when you're dropping off your kid if this is one of those places. There was even a Hollywood film made about this, and I think it was just called Snake Pit or The Snake Pit, that they talk about in this book. I think it was up for like 9 Oscars or something, won like 7 of them. It made a strong impact on people. And so this was the time frame that Donald's parents had him institutionalized. But in his case, it went well. He didn't, as far as the book goes into, he didn't suffer abuse or anything like that. He had a very good experience with where he was sent, and he stayed there over a year. It was while he was in this period that this doctor, I think his name is Dr. Keller, Dr. Keller looked into Donald's case, and Dr. Keller was the one that first came out and called these traits that Donald had. He grouped it together and called the condition autism. Dr. Keller was quick to say that he did not make up the term autism. Actually, where that came from was in the early 1900s, maybe even late 1800s. Autism was a term that was used for schizophrenic patients, people that had extreme cases of schizophrenia where they would pull away completely from interacting with people in their present world, and whenever they started to withdraw more and more into themselves and just live within their heads completely, that was considered autistic behavior within the schizophrenic diagnosis. And it was Dr. Keller that looked at that and decided to use that term to make it its own individual diagnosis. But he also is quick to say that he didn't make up the condition, that autism was always there. It's always been present. We just didn't have the name for it. It's a thing with human nature. It's like we're much more comfortable with things when we have a name for it, when we can identify it, and we can go from there. That was a big thing with him, just putting a name on it so that these children and adult patients that were displaying these behaviors would stop being just shucked away as mentally insane or having glandular disorders or something like that. And also, it wasn't like Dr. Keller just came in and just took one look at Donald and was like, oh, it's autism. That came about from like, I think over 4 years of him studying not only Donald, but dozens of other cases of children that were displaying the same behavior. And it was over that course of those years that he came together and said that, oh, okay, this is what we can call it. The way Donald's story panned out, as it turned out, was Donald did really well in early years of school. Like, I'd say, I would guess probably up to like 2nd, 3rd grade. I think he seemed to do pretty well because, you know, in those very early grades between, you know, like preschool to kindergarten up through like 2nd grade, there's not a lot of academic demands put on you, at least not in the States. Or I don't know, maybe there is now, but at least when I was in school, there wasn't a lot put on you. You'd learn some math, some English, yeah, you were taught to read, but a lot of the focus in those first early years of school seems to be put more on creativity and just getting you comfortable with using your brain and your imagination and working well with others and all of that. And then once you have that established, then in later grades it gets more academic and more project-based and that kind of thing. And it wasn't just with Donald's case they saw this in a number of other cases after Donald, that a number of autistic children were showing that they did really well in those early years of school when there wasn't a ton of textbook work thrown at them, when it was just interacting with people and having creative time. And the autistic children seem to do really well with the scheduling because it's very clear cut. When you're in those early grades, said, okay, we spend this much time doing this, okay, from this time to this time we do painting, and this time to this time we do nap. And a lot of autistic children seem to do well in that structure that's very clear cut, and They know exactly where they're expected to be. You know, when you get into later grades, the scheduling gets a lot more flexible, a lot more all over the place. You're expected to improvise a lot more with your studies and scheduling things, and that's the studies that Keller came across. That seemed to be where kids were starting to falter a little bit. Also with language arts, there's more emphasis put on language arts and history when you get into later grades, and that seemed to be another area where autistic children were struggling a little bit, but the same children were also doing really well in mathematics. So in Donald's case, what his parents decided to do was they said, okay, he does really well with structure, obviously, so we'll take him out of school for a while. And they actually sent him to the farm of a family friend and had him go live on the farm. The family friend that owned the farm, he had Donald live with him for a while, and Donald took on the farm responsibilities. And it seemed to really help him because he seemed to thrive in this environment where it catered to the things he was good at and the things he had comfort in. So he did well with the structure of getting up early and saying, okay, you're expected to do this for this amount of time every day. And there was, you know, with farm life, there's sort of a checklist you mentally go through of all the things you need to do during the day. And yeah, I imagine there is also that element of improvising when things don't go quite as you planned, but it's on a much lesser scale than when you're in school, I would say. So he seemed to do really well in that environment, so much so that he was able to return to school, normal public school, in high school years. And he still struggled a little bit with the language and the history, but he got decent grades. And, you know, his grades didn't show him as struggling any more than any other kid in school. And his socialization was much stronger. So he even went on to join FFA, drama club, choir, and Donald went on to have a perfectly normal academic career. He got out of high school, went into community college, and, you know, finished out a degree program and went on with his life. So he was one of the strong cases that gave doctors a lot of information about how to successfully work with people with this condition and not just stick them in a hole somewhere because they didn't know what to do with them. One of the other ones that stood out to me as far as like the case studies they go over in the book is this story that starts in the 1960s. They talk about this case of this guy, Stephen Tepper. Shortly after he was born, he developed a pretty strong case of jaundice as a newborn. Just not uncommon necessarily, but the thing that would later play into his autism story was the fact that his mother recalls that when he had this case of jaundice, she felt a little bit guilty because she was disappointed in the way he physically looked. Of course, she loved him and took care of him, but she had this ideal of having this beautiful pink rosy baby, and she was disappointed with having this child that was very yellow skinned and sickly. But the thing was that Stephen, you know, like most kids that go through jaundice periods, he eventually got over it, and it wasn't an issue after, you know, a few months. And the thing that came to haunt his mother was a few years later. I think he was 2 or 3 years old when he was diagnosed. The thing that came to haunt his mother was when his mother went to get him evaluated, when his behavior started to change a little bit. The doctors explained to her that he had autism and that it was likely her fault. Yeah. By the time that Stephen's mother took him to the doctor, there was this overall consensus with a lot of doctors that autism was based off of the mother not loving the child enough. No joke. That was the mentality of doctors who went to medical school. They were telling mothers that, oh, well, your kid has this because you didn't love him enough. And surprisingly, the source of this idea came largely from a Time magazine article that was published in the 1940s with, guess who being quoted? Dr. Keller, the guy who came out with the term autism itself and had been revered as this sort of pivotal person within this branch of medicine. And in his early days, Dr. Keller was known for saying that autism had always existed, that it wasn't any fault of the parents, that, you know, it was something that happened in the brain and we just have to work with it. That's what he was saying in his early career. When this Time magazine article came out, Dr. Keller came out and said that, yeah, it's because of these cold-hearted mothers who emotionally freeze out their children and make themselves emotionally unavailable. And he didn't say the words himself, but Time magazine took his quote and came up with their term, which they called refrigerator mothers. And after that article came out, that's the diagnosis or the information that they were giving mothers that came in with autistic children after that. It's like, oh, well, you must be a refrigerator mother because that's how this condition develops.
That's not how it works. That's not how any of this works.
And this went on for a long time, this belief. And it was worsened by another doctor that came out, Bruno Bettelheim, I think was the name. And he took it further and said, it's not just that these mothers are emotionally cold to their children, it's that children develop autism because the mother secretly wants that particular child dead for some reason. This wasn't just witch doctory. This was like legit medical opinion being circulated around. And this wasn't like the 1800s. This was in the 1960s. People were still spreading this opinion that it was because your mother didn't love you and she wanted you dead, and that's why you got autism. And this went on for a long time until one particular mother came forward, this woman, Ruth Sullivan. And Ruth Sullivan had a background in medicine. She was an Army nurse. She had a master's, I think was? Yeah, she had a master's in public health. And she was married to a literature professor, and they ended up having an autistic son. And Ruth came out and said, you know, I can swear that it's not because I don't love my son enough. That's ridiculous. And she decided that, you know, between her and her husband, she said, we're educated people. This can't be the only answer. We should look into this and figure out what the real truth is. And when Ruth went to medical professionals and asked them herself, she said, what kind of reading materials can you recommend me? I want to learn more about this condition. The medical professionals actually told her not to bother with reading what's out there because they said the material that's out there regarding autism would just confuse her. They just wanted her to let it go and trust medical professionals. And she was like, yeah, no, because that's clearly not working. So she became an advocate for parents of autistic children coming together and creating a support group among themselves, sharing their stories and their concerns and building a network that way. And you know, sort of saying, at least for now, just screw the medical professionals that are spreading this craziness. We're gonna go find out what the truth is ourselves. And she found an advocate partner in this guy, Bernard Rimland, who was, I got all sense of hometown pride because I found out the guy was from San Diego. And I was like, yeah. And Dr. Rimland started as a locksmith in Gaslamp Quarter and went on to study psychology at SDSU and got his doctorate at Penn State, I want to say. Yes, Penn State. And Dr. Rimland ended up being the father of an autistic son. And he was aware of this refrigerator mother theory as well. And he came out too and said, I've seen my wife with our son, and there's no way you could say that woman doesn't love her son. She's the most attentive, gentle person in the world with him. So again, he came out and said, okay, well, that theory is bullshit. Let's find out what the truth is. And he took it upon himself to study autism and find out the truth rather than this just accepted craziness. Gathered all of the case studies that were documented up to that point, which at the time were about 250 cases of documented autism, and studied all of those. He went and talked to a number of medical professionals. He even contacted, I was just looking at my notes and I just realized I think I've been calling the Dr. Keller, but I think his name is actually Dr. Canner. He reached out to Dr. Canner, who originally, was attached to this refrigerator mother crap. And he reached out to him, and he reached out to Dr. Bettelheim, wanted to interview them and work with them. Not surprisingly, Dr. Bettelheim told him to piss off, basically, because Dr. Rimland was coming out and essentially refuting everything that Dr. Bettelheim had based his career around. So it's no surprise that Dr. Bettelheim had that reaction. But surprisingly, Dr. Canner came back out and said, because Dr. Canner had, once this turnaround came with Bruce Sullivan and Dr. Rimland, Dr. Canner had such a backlash with being attached to this refrigerator mother theory that he kind of wanted to repair his reputation. And at one point, Dr. Canner even gave a speech where he said something like, I absolve you parents of any sin, or something like that. I think he wanted to come back sort of into the fold and be well thought of again, because by the time Dr. Rimland came around, Dr. Canner was sort of approaching the end of his career. He was much more elderly, and so he probably wanted to go out on a high note. So he worked with Dr. Rimland, and even when Dr. Rimland released his book on his studies, Dr. Canner even wrote the foreword to it, which I thought was pretty cool. But again, with the studies that Dr. Rimland did, it wasn't an overnight thing. It wasn't just him churning out this book saying y'all are wrong. He spent over 4 years, much like Dr. Canner did when he did his studies. Dr. Rimland spent over 4 years looking into all of these cases and doing interviews and backing up his theories and documenting everything, so that when he came out with his findings, he had a really strong base to go off of and saying, look, these doctors have been wrong all this time. You mothers need to stop beating yourself up. It's not your fault. It was an incredibly important work he did. And then building on top of the work that Dr. Rimland did, Dr. Lorna Wing came out. Again, Dr. Lorna Wing was the mother of an autistic child. She published a book that was simply called Autistic Children, where she coined the term autism spectrum, because she said that she was studying cases herself and said that there are traits that are recognizable and usually sort of flagged as autistic behavior, but there is no one way for autism to be displayed. It's, just because you have certain traits and you don't have other ones doesn't mean that it's not autism. It pops up in a variety of ways. And so she said, in order to accommodate all of these different variations of the condition, we need a term that makes that clear. So she came out with the term autism spectrum to show that there's no one way for it to show itself. When she did her own case notes, she also got in the habit of, when it came to patients that were displaying signs of Asperger's, she was one of the first doctors that in her case notes was writing the term Asperger's syndrome, because she said previous to that, she saw that the conditions that would fall under Asperger's now, those cases were being labeled as autistic psychopaths, which she said, you know, when I have to confront parents and, you know, explain to them what's going on with their child, autistic psychopath comes off as really harsh. I don't really like that term. We need something a little bit more digestible to these parents that have children with this condition. And so she came up with the term Asperger's syndrome. And the funny thing she noticed is that parents were taking the term Asperger's syndrome a lot more gently than parents who had to hear just the word autism for some reason, even though it's all part of the same spectrum. A lot of parents for some reason were just crushed when they heard autism, but she's, at least back in when she was doing the initial studies with this, using this term, she said that the Asperger's diagnosis seemed to go over a lot more easily than just hearing the word autism, which I thought was interesting. But anyway, once she introduced that term, Asperger's syndrome, a lot of other doctors were agreeing with her and saying that, oh, that is a lot less harsh. A lot of other doctors were picking up on that term and using it, to the point where by 1992, World Health Organization was including it in their manual, compendium, whatever you want to call it. It was called, their book was called the International Classification of Diseases. It's, like I said, sort of a compendium. In 1993, American Psychiatric Association came behind them and put it in, at the time, their most recent publication of the DSM manual, which, speaking of the DSM manual, autism itself was not included in the DSM manual until the 1980s. And then strangely, Asperger's syndrome was dropped from the DSM manual in 2013 when the American Psychiatric Association reevaluated the terms of and the definition of Asperger's, and they basically came out saying, we're not convinced Asperger's by itself is actually a thing. So they just sort of bundled everything, all of the traits, under autistic spectrum disorder, I think they called it. And so when you look in the DSM, that's what it's under, is they just bundled everything under autism spectrum disorder. Which they talk about in this book, that when the American Psychiatric Association came up with that decision, the people that previously had been diagnosed with Asperger's were understandably offended to have these doctors now go back and say, I don't know if it's a real thing. But that was their decision. So now if you look it up, it is under autism spectrum disorder in the DSM. Basically, the book just closes with an overview of how far autism research has come, but the areas we still need to work on. For one thing, they mentioned that the ball has kind of been dropped on adult autism research. There's a lot of studies that have been done with children, but there's not a lot of attention that's given to, okay, well, eventually those children are going to grow up. What can we do for adults that have to function in a non-autistic world? And that's where the research sort of drops off. And you know, they talk about how we need to pick that back up and do right by autistic adults. And so they discuss a few of the programs and foundations that are in the works now to sort of remedy that lack. The authors themselves have autistic connections. I think if I remember right, I think they said that John Donvan, his brother-in-law, I think, is autistic, and then Caren Zucker, I think, is the mother of an autistic child. So they have personal connections to their works in here. So that was pretty much all of the highlights that I wanted to cover in the book. There's a lot more in here, but you know, like I said, it's like 700 pages and I want to go over everything. But there were a few passages in here I thought I would like to share that really stood out to me. One is in here when they're talking about the sort of lexicon of autism. and the terminology that was used back in the day that we had to progress out of. It says, throughout the first half of the 20th century, the lexicon of disability also included terms such as cretin, ignoramus, simpleton, maniac, lunatic, dullard, dunce, demented, deranged, schizoid, spastic, feeble-minded, and psychotic, appearing in lectures and scholarly writings. These terms, when used by men of medicine, were intended only to be clinically descriptive and specific. Inevitably, however, each of these words would be co-opted by the public and deployed out of their clinical context, used to mock, wound, and stigmatize. Such shifts in meaning forced the earliest professional organizations for intellectual disability in the United States to go through 5 name changes in its history. Founded in 1876, the Association of Medical Offices for American Institutions for Idiotic and Feeble-Minded Persons became in 1906 the American Association for the Study of the Feeble-Minded. In 1933, it was renamed the American Association on Mental Deficiency. In 1987, it became the American Association on Mental Retardation. And in 2006, the American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. Redisability, a high-toned way of saying delayed, has long since become the root word for a variety of slurs in the culture at large. Another term in this category was mongoloid, used to describe people born with Down syndrome. Later regarded as a double insult because of its racial connotations, it was at one time so widely accepted that Benjamin Spock used a variant of it in the first edition of his best-selling book on parenting. The term disappeared from later editions along with Spock's advice to parents of children with Down syndrome. His original counsel was, of course, nothing more than the conventional wisdom of the time. The advice nearly all parents were given when they were told that their child was going to grow up to be a good deal different from normal. For parents who planned to simply embrace the child to make him or her part of the family, the advice from doctors was blunt: don't. So yeah, that shows you we've come a good far way from that ridiculousness. There was also another crazy section in here about the use of eugenics back in the day. It says eugenics, derived from a combination of other relatively new sciences such as anthropology and zoology, genetics, and psychometrics, opened up the possibility of purging rot and impurity from the lineage of humanity. President Teddy Roosevelt himself touted a eugenics manifesto called The Passing of the Great Race, written by his friend, New York lawyer Madison Grant. In his book, Grant recommended a program of mass selective breeding to rid the United States of the genetic influence of the weak, broken, and mentally crippled, the millions of citizens he deemed worthless and wretched. Roosevelt praised the book's compendium of facts our people most need to realize. That was sort of disappointing because I generally have been impressed with Teddy Roosevelt, so to read that I was like, oh man. A young man wrote Grant a fan letter from Austria announcing that his book was now his Bible. His name was Adolf Hitler. Grant argued for the forced sterilization of people deemed not worthy of procreating. So powerful was the enthusiasm for eugenics that 17 states legalized forced sterilization in the 1920s. The measures found support all over the political spectrum. In 1926, Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood and a defender of the disadvantaged, said to a Vassar College audience, "The American public is taxed, heavily taxed, to maintain an increasing race of morons which threaten the very foundation of our civilization." The state of Mississippi's sterilization law was written to cover hereditary insanity, feeble-mindedness, idiocy, and epilepsy. In fact, Mississippi was less aggressive in sterilizing its disabled than some other states. By 1933, the year Donald was born, Donald, the first case I was talking about earlier, by the time he was born, 12 people had been forced to undergo the procedure versus 1,333 in Virginia and 8,504 in California. In 1939, Mississippi's laxity seemed to bother an editorial writer for the Delta Democrat Times in Greenville, envying Virginia's record and the money the state was set to save by practicing preventative eugenics, which reduced the financial burden of caring for defectives The writer suggested, hopefully, that Mississippi might profit from Virginia's example. Of course, Hitler, once in power, took things a great deal further. He started World War II 8 months after that Delta Democrat's Time editorial, and under his rule, following his Bible, the number of disabled Germans murdered to purify the racial stock of the Third Reich reached into the tens of thousands. Yeah, there was actually a time where even in the US, we thought it was okay to use eugenics to purify the race, which I think is tragic and insane. One of my favorite sections in this whole book was the part that describes the process that Ruth Sullivan went through after the doctors told her not to worry about educating herself and that the material would just confuse her. There was a section in here I thought was pretty awesome when they described what she did after that. It said, Ruth went to the library at the State University of New York in Albany and read through all the books and medical journals she could find that listed autism in the index. At the end of it, she was no longer confused, she was furious. Were they serious, these writers? That Joe is her son, that Joe had autism because she was cold, rejecting, and over-anxious? Where was the science, she asked herself, and where was the research on how actually to help her son? So many mothers before her had heard this same account of autism and had been crushed by it. Even those bold enough to question it usually questioned themselves even more because expert opinions weighed against them, and because parents of disabled children so often feel a twinge of guilt deep inside, the unbearable suspicion that your children are paying the price for something they may have done. But Ruth did not succumb to those thoughts and feelings. She knew what the theory said, but in reality, the theory of her own kitchen table and the 9 chairs around it told her something more persuasive. Ruth and her husband were full participants in the baby boom, as well as being Irish Catholics. The oldest of 8 children herself, she was now the mother of 7. 7 children, all loved and mothered the same way, but only one had autism. It was an experiment with a ready-made control group. 6 to 1, evidence like that was all Ruth needed. It was the shield of common sense, and common sense was how Ruth approached everything in life. Not for a moment did she entertain the thought that she made Joe autistic. Not then, not ever. Still, she was appalled by the implications of everyone else buying into the refrigerator mother scenario. It caused harm in so many ways. It rendered the psychiatric profession useless as a resource. It stifled any impulse to conduct research on other plausible causes of autism. It brought pain and confusion to parents, especially the mothers who were already overwhelmed by the sheer amount of work required to raise a child with autism at home, or by the sorrow of putting that child in an institution. Above all, it wrote off the children because the prescribed therapy aimed at the mother was doomed to fail from the start. Realizing all of this awakened the doer in Ruth. It was time to lead a change against the status quo and do it as a mother, even if being one robbed of her credibility in the eyes of professionals. She intended to reverse the dynamic, ensure that mothers' insights were taken seriously and that their actual needs were being addressed. She believed in the power of large numbers, the potential of a group of women to force change. She set out to put a group together for the small universe of mothers whose children had this uncommon condition. The problem was finding them. Autism existed almost in secret. Parents tended not to talk about it or even circulate much. They dropped out of activities, quit clubs, stopped going to parties, and spent less time with relatives outside of their immediate families. Keep in mind, this is the 1960s when Ruth is going through this. Most mothers in this situation had no idea how many other mothers like them were out there, and part of their anguish sprang from the idea that they were in it on their own. Short of putting an ad in the newspaper or stapling flyers to telephone poles, Ruth had no way to reach them. And then, like a gift, came the invitation to join the new group being organized by a psychiatrist she disliked so much. Ruth called the woman's office and accepted. She was going back there, but for the last time. So Ruth used this opportunity, even though she was going sort of into the lion's den in a way, because she was going back to this psychiatrist that had essentially told her that it was her fault that her son had autism. But the psychiatrist had figured out a way to bring a bunch of these women together. So Ruth used that opportunity to go back, and yeah, she had to deal with somebody she wasn't impressed with and like, but it got the women together, and so she used that opportunity to get the women together and form their own group. It was a way to communicate with them that she might have not otherwise had an opportunity to get to. So I was really impressed with Ruth's story. And just overall, really enjoyed everything I learned in this book. I will say that I don't know that I would say that it's a necessary page turner all the way through. There is a lot of interesting history, but it's one of those ones I would recommend maybe doing a chapter here and there, like maybe every night do a chapter or two, you know, with whatever other book you have on your nightstand, just because it is bulky. It does cover a ton of history. It's good to maybe not plow through it and just take it in little by little. Otherwise, I think the information can get overwhelming. That, and there were a few sections in here that struck me as a little bit dry. So it wasn't like cover to cover blow my mind amazing, but as far as like what's out there, I think it's probably one of the most comprehensive all-in-one type books on the condition that you could find to date. So definitely recommend checking this out if this is a topic you're interested in learning more about. So, good Lord, this video is going to be kind of long, but that's why I did this book by itself, because I figured that was going to happen with the size of this book. And like I said, I didn't even cover everything that was in that book. I was just marking some of the things that stood out to me. So thanks for watching this far, and hope you found some interesting items here to talk about. Maybe look into getting this book yourself. And yeah, I guess we'll see you in the next video. I have, I think, 2 more autism themed videos to bring out to you guys. That'll be more about like the fictional side of autism. Not fictional side of autism, like novels that involve autism, I mean. So we'll see you then, guys. Thanks for watching. Bye.